Conflict is like this vase. It can crack under pressure or shatter completely unless you learn how to handle it carefully. What if I told you that avoiding conflict is like putting a fragile vase in a closet, hoping it never gets bumped? Sooner or later it will. Let's talk about why some people fear conflict so deeply and how to face it head on without breaking relationships or yourself. I once worked with a client who couldn't bear even the smallest disagreement at work. She avoided conversations, let resentment build, and eventually quit her job because she believed that conflict was something that she couldn't handle. And when we dug deeper, we found her fear of conflict that stemmed from her childhood, growing up in a home where disagreements always turned ugly into yelling and tears. I helped her to rewrite her relationship with conflict, teaching her skills to navigate it calmly and productively. And today she actually leads a team and she thrives in discussions that she once avoided. I've been there too. For years, I mistook avoiding conflict for maintaining the peace until I realized that it only buried problems deeper. So let's unpack this fear and the skills to overcome it. Why do people fear conflict? There are several reasons, and the first is childhood trauma. Many fears of conflict trace back to childhood experiences where arguments escalated into chaos, and children who are exposed to loud fights, emotional withdrawal, or even violence grow up equating conflict with pain or danger. And Dr. John Gottman, who's an expert on relationships and families, says this: children who experience repeated exposure to unresolved conflict often develop a sense of insecurity and a fear of confrontation. Another reason is perfectionism. People who seek approval or fear disappointing others will also avoid conflict so that they can maintain an image of harmony. Another aspect is a lack of skills. Not everyone learns how to handle conflict constructively, and without those tools, it feels easier to avoid it altogether. And cultural influences also play a role here because in some cultures or in some families, conflict is stigmatized and silence is mistaken for peace. I want to talk about different types of conflict and what their impact is on us. We get internal conflict, and that is when we're struggling with our own emotions or our own decisions. For example, when we feel guilty about prioritizing work over family. Now, the impact of that is that it erodes our self-confidence and our mental health. There's also interpersonal conflict, and that is disagreements between individuals. For example, a couple who argues about finances. Now, this can strengthen or weaken their relationship based on how it's handled. When we look at workplace conflict, miscommunication between colleagues, for example, when an employee feels undervalued and withdraws from teamwork, that can hurt the team morale and also impact productivity. And looking at parent-child conflict, for example, when a team wants more independence, but the parent enforces strict rules, this can lead to strained family bonds or even rebellion in some cases. Now, we also have cultural or value-based conflict, and this is when we have differing opinions on sensitive topics like religion or politics, for example. And this polarizes relationships. Team conflict is a different thing because this is where employees, for example, clash over leadership decisions. And this sort of conflict will undermine collaboration unless, again, it is resolved effectively. Conflict avoidance, such as when a partner suppresses their feelings to keep the peace, can lead to long-term resentment, and that creates emotional distance between people. And then there are also power struggles, sibling rivalry over parental attention, for example. This can create lasting animosity if it's not resolved. Conflict with authority in a case where employees are pushing back on rigid managing styles, for example, can either inspire growth or it can lead to turnover of staff. Unspoken conflict, such as passive-aggressive behavior between friends or between partners, breeds mistrust and miscommunication. And then online conflict is something that also occurs quite a lot these days, where heated debates on social media take place. Now that amplifies misunderstanding due to a lack of face-to-face interaction. And finally, I want to talk about conflict in a crisis situation, where families are arguing over how to handle a loved one's illness or last wishes, for example. Now, that can also either unite people or fracture relationships. It all depends on how we handle it. Conflict isn't the problem, it's how we handle it. Without conflict, innovation stagnates. Relationships grow distant and personal growth just stalls. As conflict expert Patrick Lencioni said, the fear of conflict is almost always a sign of problems. So let's look at the dynamics of conflict. In families, we see that unresolved conflict between parents teaches children unhealthy coping mechanisms. For example, if parents fight but they never reconcile in front of their children, the kids may grow up fearing emotional vulnerability. And in the workplace, a leader who avoids conflict sets the stage for unresolved tension, and that hurts the team productivity and it affects the trust. I've made 2 other short videos you can watch to gain more insight into these dynamics. Stop Fighting and Master Civil Disagreement. And the other one is Arguing is Not Fighting if Done Constructively. The links are in the description if you want to watch these videos. I'm going to give you some tools for managing conflict, okay? Practical tools to face conflict constructively and confidently. First of all, reframe your mindset. Start viewing conflict as an opportunity for growth rather than a threat. And practice active listening. This is very important because you need to listen to understand, not respond. Reflect the other person's words back to them to show that you understand and to show that you have empathy for their viewpoint. But also very important, set ground rules. So agree on respectful behaviors like avoiding shouting or interruption, for example. Focus on the issue, not on the person. So use phrases like, that is what I'm struggling with, rather than you're the problem. Use I statements, and I'm sure this is something you've heard a lot. For example, say, I feel unheard when you interrupt me, rather than you always interrupt me. And if it's necessary, take a break. If emotions run high, rather pause and return to the conversation at a later stage. You don't have to go through it all in the heat of the moment. It's also important to acknowledge the other person's perspective, so find common ground before you dive into a disagreement with someone. And debrief after resolving the conflict. It's very helpful to reflect on what worked and what didn't work between the two of you, because that will strengthen your future interactions. For high-stakes conflicts, bring in a neutral third party. This is very important and very helpful. And finally, commit to growth. Embrace conflict resolution as an ongoing skill, not a one-time fix. Conflict doesn't have to shatter your relationships or your confidence. With the right skills, it can actually polish and strengthen them. If you've been avoiding conflict or feel stuck in unproductive cycles, take that first step toward growth today. Share your thoughts below. What's the hardest conflict that you've faced and how did you handle it? Let's learn from each other.